All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's April Nature and You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate over at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a small conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in the region. The region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and the neighboring areas of the Central Valley. In particular, we focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we recently helped lead the effort to expand. In addition to that advocacy work for public lands, we also do a variety of education programs, including K-12 field trips, natural history and policy articles in our newsletter, and of course, this monthly lecture series. We also run a range of adventures programs, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. If you'd like to learn more about any of these or our other projects, you can do so over at our website, tuleyome.org. So on to tonight's lecture. Tuleyome is supported in part by donations from folks like you. If you haven't already done so, we greatly appreciate a donation tonight to help support the good work that we do. And so tonight we are very lucky to have Aaron Haiman as our speaker. Aaron is the author of a brand new book, Birds of the California Delta, which is going to be a focus of his talk tonight. He's been doing science outreach for well over a decade through his blog and YouTube page, A Birding Naturalist, which I recommend. Aaron has master's degrees in avian science and animal behavior from UC Davis and currently works for the state as a senior environmental scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Board. During the talk, we ask that you keep yourselves on mute and hang on to any questions until the end, at which point we'll have some time for Q&A with Aaron. All righty, so I will stop sharing and turn it over to you, Aaron. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Jeff. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? Awesome. Well, yeah. So thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to be here. Jeff, thanks for having me. And I'm excited to talk to you about my book, but also, see if this works, if I can advance these slides. Also kind of the Delta in general and a little bit more of sort of the issues surrounding it. So what I'm hoping to go over is a little bit of a more introduction of myself, talk a little bit about what a delta is in general, and then dial into our specific delta, the one that I wrote my book about, and the birds that you find there that make it such an amazingly special place. And then I do want to talk about some of the threats to the delta. And in fact, some of the birds I'm going to focus on are sort of the ones most threatened at the moment. And then I kind of want to wrap up on a high note, bring it back up again, talk about recognizing the delta, the importance of it, the attention it's gotten on the national scale, and also the work done to restore it to its sort of former historic glory, at least in some part. So with that, a little bit about me. I was homeschooled from preschool until I started going to junior college, which I attended at College of Marin, and big fan of community colleges. After that, I transferred over to UC Berkeley, where I received my bachelor's in environmental science. And then, like Jeff mentioned, off to UC Davis for 2 master's degrees, avian science and animal behavior, which is where I know Jeff from. In amongst those, I've held a variety of sort of bird-related internships. I've been a bird guy since I was about 6 years old. And so yeah, bounced around the country doing various bird research and conservation internships for a while. And then after finishing up with graduate school, I worked briefly with the Department of Water Resources, and then a much longer stint with a different state agency called the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, which is where I really dug in and got my feet wet, really working in the Delta. I'd lived in the Delta, I birded in the Delta, but it was at the Delta Conservancy where I really worked there and did it sort of from a professional standpoint. And then after being there for a while, an exciting opportunity opened up at the Wildlife Conservation Board that I jumped at, and I've been here for about almost 4 years now. So that's kind of where I come from a sort of educational professional background. But yeah, I've also got this kind of science communication passion project on the side. I write a blog of my own that I've been doing. It just turned 13, so I have a teenager blog. And I've also written for many other popular science magazines and other website, a variety of other websites. I have my own YouTube channel, all sort of under the same title of A Birding Naturalist. And I'm also active on a variety of social media platforms. So lots of ways of keeping in touch with me and kind of trying to share knowledge of birds and science and nature with as wide an audience as I possibly can. Other ways that I do that in person, I lead bird walks pretty frequently, which are awesome. And I also lead a birdathon. This is a group of young birders, it's a youth birdathon team that I participate in with Point Blue Conservation Science. And to the best of my knowledge, this youth team, the Drakes Beach Sanderlings, is the longest running youth team around in existence. And I'm very proud of them. And I was very proud to be one of the founding youth members way back in the day. And it's been really fun to sort of move on and now lead the team. And then in terms of science communication, my latest endeavor is this book, kind of the newest chapter, if you will, in my life, Birds of the California Delta. It's something that I've done in partnership with Martha Espinoza, who did all of the illustrations for this book. And Martha is an incredibly talented nature scientific illustrator in Costa Rica. And she and I met over Instagram, so one of the wonders of the internet. And she and I worked on a couple of smaller projects previously. And then when this larger project, the book thing, came along in my life, I thought of her and I reached out to her and see if she would be willing to partner with me. And she said yes. And I was absolutely delighted. And so she's really what makes the book shine in a lot of ways. Her work is beautiful, including this cover of these two white-faced ibis. The whole thing has been shepherded through by Heyday Books, which has been a great publisher. They're a small independent book publisher based in Berkeley, and they do a lot of very California-focused nature, bird, sciencey kind of books. So it was a really great fit for this project. And in fact, this particular volume, is the fourth in the series of hyperlocal bird books that Heyday has created. Each book kind of has the same basic format, where they dial into a very small geographic area, not, birds of North America, not even Western birds, not even California birds, but smaller than that. And they ask a expert in that area to write about 25 species that really embody and characterize the birds of that specific region. And so that's what mine does. And that's what sort of each of the other 3 previous volumes in the series have done for their various regions. So I encourage you to look them all up. And if any of them appeal to you, they're obviously targeted at very different areas, but they're all really interesting areas with really interesting birds, and by some very cool authors. Now, through all of that work, through all of my professional work and also my science communication work, I really strongly believe that birds are for everybody, nature's for everybody, science is for everybody. And so I've worked really hard to make sure that I'm broadening the number of seats at the table as much as possible, because I've definitely gotten a lot out of birding, professionally, personally. And I think that everybody else, no matter what, everybody else deserves to have those same opportunities if they are interested. So with that, and a little bit about sort of my perspective and background, let's move on to deltas. What is a delta? So it's a tract of sediment deposited at the mouth of a river. Now, oftentimes, these mouths of rivers are where a river meets the sea, but it doesn't have to be. You can have a river flowing into a large lake or some other water body. And so where that water kind of slows down and spreads out, it drops the sediment, and that sediment fan, if you will, becomes the delta. Here's a great example of a very famous delta, the Nile Delta. And you can see it forms this sort of triangular shape. And people noticed that actually, if you look at deltas around the world, they all kind of form triangular shapes of one size or another. And in fact, that's even why it became called a delta, because delta, the shape of a triangle, is the shape used to represent the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet, at least the capital version, the uppercase version, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. And so since people had noticed, hey, where rivers meet a body of water forms a triangle, and a delta is a triangle, we'll call the geographic feature a delta. And they were off to the races. Now, our delta, our special delta, is a really cool one. Right in the middle of California, it is the heart of California's water system. It is home to a tremendous diversity of habitats, and it's connected by this incredibly complex network of dozens of islands, 1,000 miles of plus waterways, this very intricate landscape, which yields a lot of nuance and detail and complexity, which we're going to be talking about a lot. Now, one odd thing about our delta is that it breaks the rule about that whole triangle thing. It's not really a triangle at all, because we have really odd geology, really special geology here in California. It started about 100 million years ago when the Sierra Nevada mountains formed, or thrust up. And at the time, the western flank of the Sierra Nevadas led into a broad plain that just led sort of smoothly down to the Pacific Ocean. That changed about 5 million years ago when various plate tectonics forces came to act and shoved up the coast range, sort of crinkled up the edge of the coast range. The next thing that happened was glaciers. About 20,000 years ago or so, a lot of the state of California was covered in ice. Some of the most famous features are in Yosemite. You have these amazing glacial valleys carved by giant rivers of ice. But the glaciers also covered a lot of the Central Valley, and they formed a lot of the valley that we see today. When about 10,000 years ago, those ice flows retreated, it left behind this broad, flat area right in this middle of the state, in between the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevadas. And as that ice pulled back, it left space for water that would flow off those mountains to form rivers. Lots and lots of rivers. We have a ton of rivers in the state of California, and most of the biggest ones, all one way or another, flow into the Central Valley, eventually kind of meeting with each other, flowing together into what we now call the Delta, and then eventually out through the Carquinez Strait. And that pinch point of the Carquinez Strait has a lot of really interesting impacts on the Delta, on the state of California in a lot of ways, and especially how water flows through the state. It means that rivers can't just rush out into the ocean. Rivers carrying inorganic sediment down from the Sierras and somewhat from the Coast Range come down, and they kind of pool and meander in this big flat valley. That leads to a lot of wetlands forming, which has wetland plants growing in it. And those wetland plants grow, but then die. And that organic matter contributes and mixes in with the inorganic matter, but it doesn't really go anywhere. None of this stuff is really able to flow anywhere. And so what ends up is it builds up in layers, layer upon layer upon layer of organic and inorganic material mixed together in this really rich soil. And in a particular, not just any kind of rich soil, but peat soils. Peat soils are going to play a really important part later in this talk. So I want you to remember a couple of things. And the biggest one is that they're really high in nutrients and really high in carbon. Remember that. Peat soils are high in carbon. Now, all these nutrients means that it's really good for agriculture. And in fact, humans have been living in and around deltas for thousands of years and growing a lot of our food for thousands of years. And our delta is no exception to that. And along with the food that we grow, it also supports, like I said earlier, a huge array of habitats. We've got everything in our delta. We have from wetlands to sloughs, big bodies of open water, huge gallery forests, oak savannas, open grasslands. We've got vernal pools, so many different types of habitats in a relatively small area of the California Delta, which makes it a really fun, exciting place to go you can go birding in the Delta and travel a relatively short distance and hit a bunch of different habitats, which means seeing a bunch of different species. And there are a lot of species to see, from plants, mammals, reptiles and amphibians, insects, fish, both migratory and resident, and of course, birds, both migratory and resident. All of these things, so many species can be found in the Delta. Makes it a very fun place, very entertaining, and sort of constantly refreshing a new place to go and see. In particular, when it comes to the birds, one of the reasons why that's so important and so impactful is because of where we happen to sit in kind of a global setting. We're in something called the Pacific Flyway. And the Pacific Flyway is like a giant interstate that links as much as 3 different continents together. And while no specific bird may use every single inch of that freeway, millions of birds every year of hundreds of different species use at least sections of it. So it makes for a very important connector between a lot of different parts of the world that are used by many, many birds. And the Delta is smack on that Pacific Flyway, which means that it's really important both as a stopover site, so birds migrating through can stop in the Delta, either going south or north, and rest and find food and stock up their energy reserves so that they can effectively take on their next leg of their journey. But it's also a destination. In the summertime, birds come here to breed. In the wintertime, birds come here to spend the winter. And so any time of year, there's always some group of birds that really rely on the Delta. In total, it's about 250 species that regularly use the Delta. And like I said, you can kind of chop them up into these various categories. There are summer visitors, birds that come specifically to the Delta to find mates and find nesting habitats and raise babies and prepare those young for their next fall migration. There are birds that come here in the winter. And so these are birds usually from the north that come specifically to the Delta to rest and build up their fat reserves. And the importance of wintertime has been shown to be really, really significant, not just for the winter, but actually for this return migration and even influencing the breeding season that follows. So lots of research has shown that when a bird has a really successful, really restful, really rejuvenative winter, they do better on their migration and they actually have higher reproductive success the next year. So these sort of carry on effects. And conversely, if a bird has a really rough winter, that definitely impacts their ability to migrate and their success at migrating, and very much reduces their reproductive output that following breeding season. So what happens in the breeding season is definitely important, but what happens in the winter is also really important. There are also, like I said, these migrants that are zipping through and spending a relatively small amount of time in the Delta, but the Delta still serves as an important stepping stone along that migratory path. So even though they might not be here for very long, just like stepping stones across a lake, if you take out one, jumping over it might not be even an option. It might leave you a big enough gap where you end up in the water. And so the Delta forms one of those stepping stones, one of those links in the chain of migration. And then, of course, the fourth category are the birds that have realized, hey, this Delta, it's a pretty neat spot. Why don't we just stay here 12 months out of the year? We just won't go anywhere. And so we do have quite a few year-round residents that just live here all the time, our constant neighbors. Unfortunately, many species are at risk. The State of the Bird Report is something that's put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's focused on various geographic sort of ranges, but the primary one is the United States of America. And they look at all the species found in the USA, and they kind of look at their population levels and their population trends, and they rank them into kind of concern categories, if you will. So there are the green species that are doing just fine. There are yellow alert species, there are orange alert species, and there are red alert species. And I'll just read their definition right here. Red alert species are birds with perilously low populations and steep declining trends. So birds that are not very numerous and are not headed the right direction. They're going down. So those are the ones that a lot of people focus on for a lot of reasons. I mean, they're where you want to focus conservation in a lot of ways. They're where laws come into effect, like the Endangered Species Act, both at the state and federal level. That red alert species really draws attention, and for good reasons. And we, in fact, have 5 of these red alert species that use the delta in at least one of those life stages. And those are the ones that I kind of want to go over right now. The first one is the yellow-billed magpie, and I will be honest, I was really surprised to see this bird come up as a red alert species. Surprised and a little dismayed. The yellow-billed magpie is a California endemic. It is our bird, found in California and nowhere else on the planet. They like to live in grassy savannas. They nest usually in large trees and kind of loose colonies. And they're also pretty well adapted to exploring human-dominated environments. Really fun birds, really filled with character, always a treat to see. However, they are facing numerous threats, which is one of the things which are the reasons that have landed them on the red alert list. They are hit pretty hard by West Nile virus. Unfortunately, West Nile virus hits certain groups of birds a lot more than others. And corvids, so things like crows and ravens and jays, and yes, magpies, are the corvids. And so when those bad West Nile virus outbreaks happen, these guys often kind of take the brunt of it. Being pretty well adapted to human environments and being the clever corvids and omnivores that they are, means that they often get exposed to rodenticides because they have a really wide range of food types, including rodents when one wanders across their path. And so sort of secondary poisoning is definitely something that these guys face. And then while they are doing fairly well exploring human ranges in many ways, they still are facing habitat loss in a lot of ways. In particular, they really like to nest in pretty big trees. And so when humans come into a landscape, oftentimes they remove a lot of those big trees. And so that really impacts the breeding success of this species. So kind of all those things come together to land this bird, small geographic area just in California, so its population was never huge, and it's heading down. So that is why this is a red alert species. Another one is the tricolored blackbird. This one is, I sort of talk about this as a near endemic. The vast majority of the range of this bird is in California, but there are a few little populations that do step outside of our borders, so it's not technically an endemic. But historically, these nested in wetlands like cattails and tules, bulrushes, and willows, stuff like that. And they nested in huge colonies. There, 100 years ago, you could find colonies where a single colony had maybe 300,000 birds in it, giant numbers. These have also been able to sort of expand a little bit into agricultural fields, but that leads to some conflicts. And because they're like wetlands, and because of these conflicts with agriculture, which I'll talk about in a second, the population has really been shrinking quite dramatically, unfortunately, to the point where now, like I said, 100 years ago, you could find a single breeding colony with 300,000 individuals. Now it's estimated the total population of tricolored blackbirds is about 300,000 individuals. So the population has really dropped quite a bit. They do have a fun migratory kind of connection because they breed in the Central Valley in the Delta. They leave, and many of them go all the way out to Outer Point Rays, which is where they spend their winter. And they like to hang out on those dairy farms. If any of you have spent time in the Outer Point Rays, you'll know a lot of that land is divided up into a series of dairy farms. And those pastures, those cattle pastures, are great spots for wintering tricolored blackbirds. You can see thousands of them, flocks and flocks, clouds of tricolored blackbirds all hanging around. It's pretty spectacular. And then, of course, they come back in the breeding season, and you can find, hopefully, big groups of them when they set up their breeding colonies here. Now, this precipitous decline in population has led them to being considered, well, to be listed formally at the state level as a threatened species. And it's being considered for listing. It's been proposed at the federal level. At this point, it's a little bit uncertain, shall we say, what the fate of those kinds of petitions are going to be, which is definitely concerning on a lot of levels. But they were at least proposed before our current administration, so we'll see what happens with that proposal. Now, like I said, the use of agricultural fields leads to some conflicts and complications, and what the really boils down to is timing. These birds have lost a lot of the wetlands that they like to live in. We humans have drained and developed a lot of our wetlands. And so as they've been pushed more and more into agricultural fields, the timing of when they breed often overlaps with the timing of when a farmer wants to harvest their crops. And so you end up in this sort of conflicting position where if a farmer leaves the birds alone, the birds do well, but the farmer loses all of their income from that field, which is sometimes a pretty devastating hit from a business economic standpoint. But on the flip side, if they go and harvest their field, yes, they make the money off that crop, but it often will lead to almost total reproductive failure of the nesting colony. So it's a complex, nuanced, kind of sticky situation to be in that people are working on and trying to find solutions to, but it definitely is going to require more of a solution than has been worked out yet to really bring these birds back and to give them the reproductive success that they need to carry on. And of course, urbanization is another reason why we've been developing all these wetlands. Wetlands are great places to hang out. We've got cities in wetlands. We have housing developments in wetlands. And so cities and housing developments offer virtually no habitat value for a tricolored blackbird. And so that doesn't do very well for them. My next species is the Ridgway's rail. As an aside, there's been a kind of ongoing effort to change the names of birds away from being named after people and more being named after the characteristics of the birds themselves. When I heard that, I'm a big fan of it for a lot of reasons, but on a personal level, I was really happy to think that maybe Ridgway's rail would go away, because saying Ridgway's rail is just, it does not come trippingly off the tongue for me. I'd be delighted if we could change its name. But anyway, this one, again, almost a California endemic. It's found in many scattered portions of the state, but it's also got some scattered breeding populations in Mexico and sort of other places in the U.S. beyond California, a little bit of Arizona here and there. They live in tidal wetlands. They are federally threatened, but they're also facing several threats. Habitat destruction, again, this is a wetland bird. We humans love to live at the edges of water, and so there's definitely a conflict there. And also, these guys get hit hard by predation, in particular by invasive species, in particular by domestic species. Cats and dogs, when they get out, tend to impact the species quite a bit. Cats especially will get out and will eat the parents, certainly eat the babies. It's another reason why it's a good idea to keep your dog on a leash, keep your cats indoors. And also, since this bird is pretty aquatic, it's often exposed to waterborne pollution. And so carrying this extra sort of load of toxins has also been shown to depress their reproductive success. So all those wrap together to put this species on the red alert list. This next one has a ridiculous name. It's called the mountain plover, and yet it is a bird of the grasslands. Yes, they live in meadows up in the mountains sometimes, and that's where they were first discovered by Europeans, and so that's where the name comes from. But really, it's grasslands all the way for this species. They're a winter visitor here in the Delta. They usually arrive in early November, and they stay all throughout the winter. How they get here, however, is kind of an unknown. This is a relatively poorly studied species, and in particular, their migration is not well known. They breed up in the mountains, they winter down here, but how they connect those dots, we don't really know. But because they live in fields, grasslands are another one of these habitat types that are very impacted by humans. We like to live in grasslands, and so we use we use them for a lot of different reasons, including like building houses in. And so that habitat destruction really impacts the species. And even when it's not houses, converting grasslands and like pasture lands, which the mountain plover likes a lot, into other forms of crops like almond orchards or vineyards means that that habitat is no longer of any use to a mountain plover. They really like those open grasslands, not trees, not shrubs, not anything like that. And so that conversion of grasslands to virtually anything else definitely negatively impacts the species. And also, because they're often associated with sort of agricultural working lands of one type or another, they're exposed to many pesticides. And so, again, this is another species where that pesticide load builds up in this bird and can impact their survival and their reproductive success. And then the last of our red alert species that is found in the Delta is the Allen's hummingbird. So we've talked about some of these individuals that are year-long residents, like the yellow-billed magpie. We've talked about some breeding birds, like the tricolor blackbird. Talked about wintering bird, like the mountain plover. This is a migrant. They don't spend a lot of time in the Delta. They zip through on their way to coastal California and Oregon, where they breed, and to a very isolated, sort of centralized pocket of habitat in central Mexico, where they spend the winter. But back and forth, they cross the Delta. And so they definitely do have a presence here. Their population has declined quite a lot, unfortunately. And this is largely due to habitat loss because of development, which is kind of because where they like to breed, think the beautiful coast of California is also where a lot of us humans like to live, think the beautiful coast of California. And unfortunately, this is a really big problem for the Allen's hummingbird in particular, because they don't like people very much. There are many hummingbirds that are very tolerant of humans. Anna's hummingbirds, our year-round resident hummingbird in California, super tolerant of people. They'll come to your feeder. I've got one in my backyard that barely moves off the feeder when I walk through the yard. Very tolerant of humans. They nest around humans. Very, very, very easygoing. Allen's hummingbirds disagree. They're willing to put up with humans a little bit, but especially when it comes to breeding, they really like distance from human disturbance. And so that sets up a kind of conflict and a problem when more and more people are living in their breeding area. However, it does highlight an opportunity. We can all help the Allen's hummingbird by planting nectar sources. So if you're on its migratory path, like you're in the Delta where I am, fantastic. They can come through, find your nectar source that you've planted for them, and then move on. And it helps give them that boost that they need on the next leg of their migratory journey. And if you live in their either wintering grounds or breeding grounds, and if you live somewhere where maybe you've got a decent sized yard, maybe a pocket of area where you don't go very often, and you can plant some nectar sources there, some native hummingbird plants, that can really give them a kind of isolated, quiet pocket of habitat that gives them what they need, where they need it. So next time you do some planting, think natives. Now, the Delta is facing a whole bunch of threats, which we've talked about some in relation to these specific individual species, but I also kind of wanted to take a wider view at. And in particular, I wanted to look at invasive species, subsidence, which is a big problem in the Delta, we'll get into, saltwater intrusion, and of course, development. The Delta is one of the most invaded landscapes in North America. Like, we're right up there with the Everglades with the number of different species that we have that are not native, but are now living and kind of taking over here. Animals like birds like starlings and house sparrows, mammals like nutria, which are an introduced species from South America, and invertebrates, things like zebra mussels and the new golden mussel, which is a brand new invader, brand new problem for us to deal with here in the Delta. Animals like these, they affect how nutrients move through the environment. They affect how these species compete with and interact with the natives that already lived here. They have a whole rippling suite of impacts on the environment and the native species that live here. And that's also true of many of the invasive plants that live here. water hyacinth, which are these sort of fleshy leaves in the front of this picture on the bottom, water primrose, which are sort of those more yellowy green leaves in the background, and arundo, which is this giant cane, huge plant that looks kind of bambooish that you can see in many parts of the Delta, and many, many more invasive species of plants. Love the Delta. They live here. They're doing great, and they're causing any number of problems. Again, how nutrients and water cycles in various parts of the Delta, they cause problems like clogging waterways and even clogging ports. The Port of Stockton has an ongoing issue where water hyacinth blooms and blossoms and reproduces and spreads and clogs up entire areas of the port. Port of Stockton is a big port, and it clogs up whole areas so that big ocean going vessels even have trouble getting through. So, an ongoing major issue in the Delta. Subsidence is kind of a special problem for the Delta. It's something that most people haven't really heard about and doesn't really happen in too many other parts of the world, but it definitely plays a big role here. And what subsidence is a shrinking of land. This sort of top figure here, which shows water on either side and kind of a marshy land that's almost at water level in the middle, is kind of what 1,000 years ago, even just a couple hundred years ago, most of the Delta would have looked like. Very wet, ground level, basically at water level, lots of emergent tules and cattails, lots of emergent vegetation, occasionally a higher point, which would hold things like trees, oaks and cottonwoods and stuff like that. And this thick layer of peat soil underneath. And remember earlier, I said, remember that peat soils, rich in nutrients and rich in carbon. And that carbon now plays a part, a big part. Because when Europeans came in and they saw the Delta and they saw these areas of wetlands, they know that that area, if you can get rid of some of the water, can dry out and be amazing cropland. And so they did that. They installed wells and they built up levees and they did all sorts of things to kind of dry out some of that soil. But as that soil dries, as peat soil dries, it's invaded by various kinds of bacteria. And those bacteria do something kind of crazy to the carbon in the peat soil. They consume it, much like we consume carbon-based foods, and they release it as a gas, much like we release carbon dioxide every time we exhale. But the crazy thing here is the scale. As these bacteria have churned through the carbon in these peat soils, once the water goes away, once it's drained and it dries out a bit, they remove and transform the carbon in the soil into carbon dioxide at such a rate that the whole level of the soil drops. And not by inches, not by feet, by tens, by dozens of feet. It's an incredible, it sounds crazy to say that the dirt underneath your shoes are being converted into a gas that floats away. But that is in fact the case. And as the water level is pumped lower and lower to dry out more and more soil, the bacteria colonizes more and more of that soil and churns more and more of it into carbon dioxide gas. The Delta is actually one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions of the state of California because of this oxidization process. Another thing that it does is it puts extra stresses on the levees. Those levees in the side are holding back rivers, sometimes holding back the ocean, basically. And as the soil level drops lower and lower and lower, the gap, the level between the top of the water and the top of the soil gets bigger and bigger and bigger as that soil just keeps dropping farther and farther away. Of course, throw in a little sea level rise and you get an even bigger discrepancy. And what that discrepancy means is extra pressure pushing in on the sides of those levees, which can eventually break and fail. And you end up with not a dry area in the middle, but an entire flooded island. This can be disastrous for people who live on that island. It can be, of course, disastrous for anyone who's farming on that island. And it's also disastrous for a lot of the wildlife because any habitat they had has now been flooded by tens of feet of water and so is not available anymore. This map on the side here shows kind of where the hotspots of subsidence are in the delta. And remember, take a note of the date on this map. It's a little bit old. I wasn't able to find the most current version of this map, unfortunately. And here, those hot red spots are 15 feet or deeper. That's a drop of 15 feet. But that's in 1995. Many of those hotspots are 35 feet below the water level now. It's a tremendous drop. And so reversing that, building that soil back up, is a long, slow, arduous process. And you're kind of playing a little bit of roulette where you're hoping that that soil builds up before a levee fails. Saltwater intrusion is another big issue. This map shows salinity levels in water. And as you can see, all that blue stuff, that's fresh water. And as long as there's plenty of rivers, all those rivers we talked about flowing down out of the Sierra, flowing down to the Coast Range, meandering their way across the Central Valley, mixing with each other, lots of fresh water. And that fresh water flows out of the Carquinez Strait. And as long as there's a pretty constant flow, it holds the salt water of the Bay and the Pacific Ocean in place, kind of at the Carquinez Strait. And that red color, that's the higher salinity Bay ocean level water. But you can imagine that if that sort of hose pressure of water, of fresh water flowing out towards the Bay weakened, if people took more and more water out of those rivers, so there was less pressure flowing out through the Carquinez Strait, that salt water would tend to push in, would matriculate into the deeper parts of the delta. This is a problem for agriculture because lots of plants can't really grow in really salty soil. It's a problem for us humans because anybody who wants to drink the fresh water of the delta isn't going to be happy if that becomes saltwater. And it's also a big problem for a lot of the animals and plants that live in the delta. Because even ones like the delta smelt, which often get a lot of attention, very sort of prominent endangered species, very rare now, it's evolved for a particular band of salinity. It likes it in a particular area, not too salty, not too fresh. If that salt water pushes in, though, it's going to really disturb where the delta smelt can live right now. And the delta smelt will have to sort of refine the new area that has just the right level of salinity, if that even exists anymore. So by changing where the salt is in the delta, it's going to have a big impact on all of the biology and ecology of the delta. And it's one of the reasons why people care about flows in the rivers so much. It's to keep the salt water out in the bay. And finally, last thing I want to talk about is, of course, development. I've already mentioned, we've built up and used a lot of our wetlands. California's lost about 95% of its wetlands, mostly to development, conversion to agriculture, all that kind of stuff. This is driven by, of course, the people who live in those areas, people who live across the state of California, because the food grown in wetland areas feeds the state of California, feeds many people across the country, feeds many people across the planet. The Central Valley grows 80 to 90% of the world's almonds. It grows 80 to 90% of the world's pistachios, 80 to 90% of the world's pecans. So these are crops of global impact, global importance. It grows so much rice that it's one of the few places that actually exports rice to China. China imports rice from very few places in the world, and the California Delta is one of them. So global impacts, but the loss of all this wetlands has, of course, had a great impact on all of the biology and ecology. And it's one of the things that people are doing to try to reverse the trend. Let's put the wetlands back in as much as we can. And in fact, that's one of the really big efforts that's going on right now. And it's really exciting to kind of be involved in this. The Delta is a big, important place. Right? We talked about the animals. We talked about the plants. We talked about the different habitats. We've talked about the agriculture and all of its importance. And that has now been recognized. The total watershed of the Delta is kind of this dark area, but that's kind of a historic way of looking at it. More modern takes have actually been trying to legally define where the delta is. And the most recent version of that is the designation of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area, which happened just in 2019. That area is defined here on this map. This is sort of where everybody's settled. This is the Delta that we now talk about. Created by an act of Congress, it's the first national heritage site in California. And again, I'll just read this from the act of Congress that designated this place, this area. The area highlights the rich tapestry of indigenous peoples and immigrants from around the world, natural beauty and wildlife and engineering marvels, bustling metropolitan areas, and picturesque rural towns. So, like I said earlier, we kind of got everything in the Delta, and that fact has been recognized by Congress and recognized for being really noteworthy and important on a global scale. So it's nice to see that happen. And along with that recognition comes the knowledge that, hey, we should fix the place up a bit. And a lot of habitat restoration projects are now doing exactly that. These are a couple of pictures, sort of before and after pictures of a project that I managed in Brentwood, so in the Delta. And this was an urban stream that flowed through Brentwood. And as you can see from the before picture, not a lot of habitat value there. The banks of this little creek, this flood control channel, have been engineered to be very steep, to not give the stream much room to wobble back and forth. It's pretty narrow. There is virtually no cover, no shade for the water or the surrounding areas. So really kind of a messed up spot. But I managed a project that went in for about a mile of this creek and set back the banks, moved those trails back, recontoured the banks so that it was much gentler grade, and actually had levels of floodplain so that at the various levels that the water was going to be at, it could flood different sort of sizes of area. Moving that bank back also gave the stream a space to kind of maneuver back and forth a little bit and be a little bit more streamlined. And the project involved planting thousands of trees and shrubs and other native plants so that it would build up this corridor of habitat. And to the point where now this aftershot is 8 years later. I went back, took a photo, and you can see there are big cottonwoods, willows, there's all sorts of elderberries and native blackberries, tons of different types of plants that now support a bunch of different kinds of birds. The fish that swim there have now cooler shaded water to live in. A really rewarding project to work on. It's really exciting to see these things happen. And this is just one of many, many projects that are happening in the Delta. There are lots of them that are underway right now. There are many more that are in the works getting planned. So it's a really inspiring, really cool time to be working. If anybody voted in favor of Proposition 4 last November, my heartfelt thanks, because that was sort of our most recent effort as a people of California to put money towards all of these projects and keep them going, create more of them. It's a really great example of how your vote matters. By casting that vote at the ballot, it really does make a real difference on the ground. And it really does work. I just have two last slides here, and they're to highlight a couple of successes. One species that's doing really well in the Delta is the Nuttall's woodpecker. It's been on, admittedly, a slight increase, but a long slight increase to the point where its population is really significantly higher than it used to be. Another near endemic, most of the birds are found in California. They're a resident of oak woodlands, which is definitely a common habitat type that we see in the Delta. Even though they don't actually eat acorns, they love oaks. And they've been a really great success story, a really reassuring story that when you build them, they come. When you create these habitats, these birds come back and do well. And a similar story is the yellow-billed yellow-billed cuckoo. Yellow-billed cuckoo is kind of a weird one, where back east, they're actually really common. But out west, they're really quite rare. Their population has not done well. They're strictly restricted to riparian areas, so habitat along creeks, along rivers. But so much of that habitat has been lost that now they're just in a couple of isolated populations around Central California. And in fact, the western population is, again, a candidate for federal endangered species listing. Again, We'll see what happens with that. But at least the proposal's been put forward. But the really amazing thing about this bird, and the thing that I wanted to bring up today, is because of how well they respond to restoration projects. Like that one in Brentwood, when you plant habitat along corridors where they need it, the type of habitat they're looking for, when you design the habitat for yellow-billed cuckoos, they can come and start using that habitat in as little as 3 years. They're very responsive to habitat restoration projects. When we build it, yes, it's hard sometimes. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it can be expensive, but it really works. And that's what I think is really inspiring and really rewarding. And so to close out, I would just like to leave you with this quote, which is actually the quote that opens my book. To hear some of our bird devotees talk, one would think that to be able to identify a bird is all of bird study. On the contrary, the identification of birds is simply the alphabet to the real study, the alphabet by means of which we may spell out the life habits of the bird. To know these habits is the ambition of the true ornithologist. Not only the life habits of the birds, but I think the same can be true for all of ecology, all the natural world. So with that, I'd love to take any questions you have. Thank you very much for your attention. And these are a bunch of different ways to keep track of me if you'd like to connect with my YouTube channel or social media or anything else. So again, thank you very, very much. And if you have questions, love to hear them.
All right. Thanks, Aaron, for a great talk. We've got a little bit of time for questions. So if you have questions, you can either type them into the chat and I can relay them to Aaron, or you can raise your hand and ask. So I think I will start off with maybe a bit of a dumb question as a non-Californian, non-wetlands person. Um, can you tell me what exactly a slough is?
Yeah, so a slough doesn't have a specific like textbook definition, but it's usually just sort of referred to a slow twisting waterway.
Okay.
So something that doesn't have a lot of current, right? It's not going to be a torrent that's going through a slough. Sort of a slow backwatery kind of place, usually with a lot of vegetation on the sides.
Gotcha. All right. Do you have any, if you're going to recommend, people are inspired by your book, they want to go see some of these birds in the Delta, what are a few places you'd recommend going to visit?
The Delta has some amazing spots to go and check out. The Yolo Bypass in the northern Delta is a great spot. Uh, Probably one of the crown jewels of the Delta is the Cosumnes River Preserve. It's kind of in the central Delta, and it's on the Cosumnes River, which is a pretty special river in California because of our major rivers. It's one of the very few that is basically undammed. So it's kind of the most naturally wild state river that we have on offer. And a lot of conservation work has been done to protect it and the land around it. And so it's a really spectacular spot to go.
Right. Um, Another question, in your book, you make use of lots of illustrations that your co-author developed. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what that collaboration looked like.
Yeah, the collaboration was really great. So, I mean, Martha is an incredibly talented uh, illustrator of plants and insects and mammals and birds. She obviously is focused on Costa Rica, since that's where she lives and is where she's from. And so it was kind of an interesting process to work with her. I sent her a lot of photos that I've taken, and also just a lot of sort of stock photos from the internet, kind of trying to talk about the positions of things that I was hoping to highlight. For a bird that I was talking about, its vocalizations, I maybe wanted the beak open, something like that. Um, so it was interesting to sort of work with her to kind of dial in what I was looking for, but then also leave her space, sort of have some creative reign. She sent me some amazing pencil sketches that are virtually work of arts on their own. And these are just her rough drafts. Like, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? But it was really interesting to see. It was really interesting to see some sort of basic assumptions that we each made. For example, the very first pencil sketch of the loggerhead shrike that she sent me um, was gorgeous, but I asked her to add a lizard in its mouth because, of course, shrikes are predators. They often hunt things like lizards and mice, and they're known as butcher birds because they take them and they stab them onto like spikes of barbed wire and thorns of
Mhm.
plants. So I wanted that sort of component to be included. But when she sent me the first pencil sketch of a shrike with a lizard in its mouth, it was an anole from Costa Rica. And I was like, okay, cool. Can we adjust that and make it into a Western fence lizard that we'd actually find in California? So it was a really fun back and forth that sort of we could each bring aspects of our own natural history knowledge to play.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I was talking about your book a little bit with my wife, and we were kind of commenting on how the having illustrated figures versus photographs really lets you kind of choose exactly what features to highlight and bring out, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very good. All right, do we have any other questions from the audience?
Oh,
So
I think
Jane has a question in the chat. I'd
yeah,
actually been wondering about this. You mentioned that the kind of bacteria-driven CO2 release out of the peat that's causing the subsidence was a pretty significant component of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Do you have a
yeah.
feel like what percentage there?
Oh, I'm not sure percentage. The number that I have offhand is I think it's the equivalent of 260,000 cars driving for a year.
Wow, so that's like a good sized city.
Yeah, exactly. It's the automotive output of a decent sized city.
Wow. Kelly is wondering if anyone is tracking the return of yellow-billed cuckoos to these wetland restoration sites.
Yes, they are. There's several different groups. There's a yellow-billed cuckoo management plan that many people work on. There are groups doing riparian restoration and also riparian bird monitoring uh, from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think there are probably groups like I know there are groups like Point Blue Conservation Science. I think maybe the Nature Conservancy that also do similar work. So yeah, they're definitely being tracked pretty carefully.
Hmm. Hmm. Jane's wondering what are the three other books in this series from Heyday?
Yeah, so the very first one was Birds of Berkeley, written by a fellow birder named Oliver James. The second one is Birds of Lake Merritt. Lake Merritt is a relatively small lake right in the middle of Oakland. It's a very urban lake. And a guy named Alex Harris wrote the book on that one. The third one is Birds of Point Reyes by Keith Hansen, a pretty darn well known bird illustrator and birder. Mine is the fourth, and actually, I've heard in the works. I believe Birds of Santa Cruz is going to be the fifth one in the series. That's probably going to come out in a couple of years from now. So it's in the works.
Very good. All right. Do we have any final questions for Aaron? Hey, if you haven't, I do encourage you to sign up for Tuleyomy's monthly newsletter so you can keep apprised of this monthly lecture series and our other fun activities that we get involved with. We also have, science articles about wildlife and plants and other environmental issues in our area. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, it's a good thing to subscribe to. All right. So with that, thank you so much, Aaron, and I hope everyone has a fantastic remainder of your Thursday evening.
Thank you very much for having me, and for all of you for coming and giving me your attention and time. It's been wonderful.